It is the late 15th century. We're in Europe. The food is bland. The plague is not being very kind at all. All is not well. To make matters worse, there is a shortage of spice. For the last 500 years, pepper, cinnamon, cardamom, nutmeg, ginger, turmeric have all been traded north along the Silk Route from places like Sri Lanka and India through the Christian Byzantine Empire. But the Byzantine Empire has fallen, and now the Ottomans, the new people in charge, are charging a hefty price for spice. The problem? Nobody knows how to get to the spice. It gets traded on and traded on and traded on and traded on so much that its origins are literally off the edge of the map. The Martellus map from that era suggests that Africa may never even end. So a sea voyage would be a tough sell. But not too tough for Christopher Columbus, an Italian explorer who reckoned he could. But instead of sailing south, he reckoned he could sail west, around the world, and into hopefully a place called Japan, that hopefully existed, that Marco Polo hopefully visited 400 years prior. So he sets off, after asking everyone for money. The Spanish monarchy, they say yes, go risk your life for some spice. After 36 days he arrives. Some natives greet him. They exchange glass beads and small amounts of gold. He believes that he has arrived in Japan, but he has actually, by accident, ran into what today is known as Cuba, in the Caribbean. Christopher Columbus has discovered America. Columbus spends the rest of his life convinced that he has discovered a western route to Asia. So much so that he sets up the colony of Hispaniola, returning to what is now the Caribbean several times to explore, promising all the time of the gold that he traded with the locals. The Spanish at Hispaniola are massacred by the locals, and these people are in turn enslaved to rebuild the colony as retribution. It is not a good start to the settlement of the New World. Columbus dies eventually in 1505, no richer than when he started, and no closer to the Spice Isles. Fast forward to 1519, and the Spanish crown has set up colonies all over the Caribbean. The system of rule is the encomienda, in which a Spanish subject is given land and the right to the labor of the locals. Hernan Cortez of Cuba is an upstart magistrate and local official who leaves his small island to secure the mainland for colonization. He leaves Cuba, and upon arriving in Yucatan, Mexico, with some 11 ships and 500 men, he mutinies, sets up his own town of Veracruz, and just for good measure, sinks all of his ships. He is not going back to Cuba. Okay, forget all about those Europeans for a bit, because this is the era known as the Age of Discovery. And it wasn't just Europeans discovering the world, it was the world discovering Europeans. So the bit we're in is before Columbus. It's known as pre-Columbian because Columbus changed absolutely everything that was going on in South and Central America. Giant empires already existed. One of these is the Aztec, whose capital, Tenochtitlan, is where Mexico City is today. This city was built on two Great Lakes that the Aztecs worked into canals. The city was navigated by these man-made rivers, which provided roads for its approximately 200,000 people. To put this into perspective, London at this time had a population of 50,000. Tenochtitlan was larger than any European city of the time. 60,000 people used the markets every weekend. The Aztecs were very religious, and their religion was not an easy one. Their towns were built around giant temples where people would gather to watch priests ritually sacrifice thousands of people. This process would require the pulling out of a person's still beating heart, decapitation, and the flaying of the skin, which in some cases could be worn as a kind of ceremonial robe. Upon building their largest temple, it is written that some 20,000 slaves met this end. Blood was a common thing on the steppes of Tenochtitlan, as in Aztec religious belief, the great god Quetzalcoatl gave up his own blood to bring to earth the Aztec people, who gave blood every day in order to honor this act, not unlike Jesus, who was on his way. As in Europe, though, the Aztec were not one people, but an empire that had conquered some 500 tribes, enslaved populations, and sacrificed whole towns atop their temples. They were in many ways not unlike European empires, converting their way through Mexico, inviting their slaves to convert to the true god, Huitzilopochtli. And at the top of this empire was the Emperor Montezuma, living in a palace in Tenochtitlan of some 300 rooms, built of plaster and concrete, adorned with feathers and gold, and behaving similarly to kings in all times and places. The Aztecs had been living like this for centuries when Cortez arrived. Guided always by their religious tales and mythology, they believed in omens. They told of the time that their god would return in the form of a man and reclaim his kingdom. So back to our boy Cortez, who's just landed in Yucatan, Mexico. He's gotten into a fight with his boss in Cuba, who's told him to come home, so he's called up his boss's boss, the King of Spain, and told him, "Hey, I'd like to assume possession of the Aztec Empire in your name. Also, send more ships, I sunk mine." And the king has replied, "Yes, of course, do it with great solemnity." So he heads inland with a few hundred soldiers, a native woman who becomes his mistress and then wife, and shipwrecked priests who could speak the language. The first people he finds are the Tlaxcaltec, a tribe who have been at the mercy of the Aztecs for centuries. This Cortez sees as an opportunity, and he acquires a native army, promising the destruction of Montezuma. The next people he meets are the Chulan. They are actual allies of the Aztec. Cortez becomes paranoid that they will attack him, as on his third day they don't provide him any food. He calls a meeting with the village leaders and he kills all of them. He burns down the temples and replaces the icons with Christian crosses. By this time it's getting pretty unambiguous what he's going to do when he gets to Tenochtitlan. He climbs further into the mountains on the roads of the Aztec Empire, eventually arriving at the doorstep of Tenochtitlan, alongside 1,000 Tlaxcaltec warriors and his own force of several hundred. Montezuma comes out of the city walls to greet him, alongside his staff of 4,000 people. They greet each other warmly. Cortez tells Montezuma that they have a bond of love. Montezuma is pretty sure Cortez is a god, or at least godlike. This seems to suit Cortez fine. Cortez then takes Montezuma hostage and over the next few months runs the capital, trying to convert people to Christianity, even though many of them suspect him of literally being their returned Aztec god. Eventually, tensions overheat. Cortez's men are accused of massacring a group of unarmed nobles and musicians, and they are run out of town by the people. Montezuma is killed in the fracas, and Cortez absolutely swears it wasn't him that did it. Many Spanish are killed as they flee the city, their boats weighed down with plundered gold. So Cortez is licking his wounds. He gets back together with his old friends, the Tlaxcalans, and for the next year he gives every tribe in the region the choice of joining him or being massacred. He returns, 1 year later, to take Tenochtitlan by force. During this year, 20,000 natives are killed at his hands. Montezuma's brother is now the king, but he knows his time is up when the Spanish, with a native army at their back, tear the great temples down, erecting Spanish-style churches, burning down the old idols, and melting down all the gold into bars to be sent back to Spain. So if we zoom out here, the Spanish have been in South America for barely any time at all. There is no formal Spanish ambassadors or anything like that. There is just this guy, Cortez, who has taken it upon himself to form a few alliances and overthrow foreign people who we know nothing about, who number in the millions. Zooming out even further, the Spanish crown were not initially planning to settle and conquer this new world. They hired Columbus, remember him, 30 years earlier, to find spice. This era of history starts up what is known as the Colombian Exchange, whereby South America received Christianity, modern technology, cattle, horses, and new fruits and vegetables, while Europe got tomatoes, potatoes, gold and silver and tobacco. Up until this point, Europe had been attached to Asia and Africa by thousands of years of interaction. The Americas were completely biologically distinct, quite literally a new world. Once the two worlds touched, it could not be undone. The natives received these things, though often only incidentally. It was the superior military technology which rendered Cortez's army so powerful. With forged iron swords, armor, cannons, and horses to sit above the battlefield, the clubs and slings of the natives were largely harmless. The most damning aspect of the exchange was disease, though. Something like 80% of all Mexican natives died due to smallpox, measles, and influenza. Part of the reason that Cortez was so capable was because, as he was the advance guard of his empire, disease had been his advance guard, killing and weakening the Aztec Empire from the moment Columbus touched down. The exchange wasn't a very fair deal, and it didn't get fairer. You may notice that no one in Europe began worshipping the great god Huitzilopochtli. This exchange ran through Africa also, and as the Portuguese, British, Dutch and Spanish empires spread further around the world, it would develop into a network of boats carrying goods, cargo, and eventually slaves between the three continents. The New World and Africa would become vassal states of Europe, whereby primary resources would be extracted and sent back, often by enslaved or impoverished local populations. Further south, in the destroyed Incan Empire, the Spanish would discover endless mineral wealth. 8 million slaves and natives would die in just one of the Spanish Empire's mines, hunting minerals. So how on earth did this all happen? How did Cortez gain control over all of Mexico with a few hundred men? How did the Spanish justify such a level of atrocity? It's helpful to remember that before the Spanish got there, the Aztecs were literally kidnapping people in order to cut out their still beating hearts. They were not well liked. Also, whilst the Spanish treated the slaves terribly, they referred to the native nobility as don and doña, literally lord and lady, exempting them from many Spanish taxes. They couldn't control the populations without the help of local leaders, who were all in their own small battles for power. This style of conquest would be copied in North America and India, and these countries were not colonized by Spain. Well, North America was a bit. Everyone was racing and rushing for power and glory. Spain was in a race for global trade against the other great European empires. The Tlaxcaltec were in a constant struggle against the Aztec. Cortez himself was looking to advance himself above his low post in Cuba and was locked in a bitter dispute with the governor. Other smaller tribes like the Totonac, who Cortez first met, were trying to ally themselves with the power most likely to win a struggle of empires. And under this competition, the lives of the vast majority of people in the world seem to have been forgotten, as they often are. So, let's talk about sources. It's important to note that half the time the people in this story didn't know what the other people were thinking, and often saying. Cortez's information was being translated by his mistress to Mayan, and then by a Franciscan priest into Spanish. Upon meeting Cortez, Montezuma is recounted as saying, "All that I have is at your disposal, and you have all the power within this land." This Cortez took to mean that he had dominion over the Aztec people. More recently, scholars have pointed out the difficulties of translation between such different people. If I say, for example, mi casa es su casa, the translation is, my house is your house, which seems to be an invitation to make oneself at home. If I translate it again, though, it might become, here, have my house. Especially if this is something that I really wanted to hear. Now consider yourself as a history student who's getting this information translated once more into English, and then once more into this video. This is the reason that it's good to get as close as possible to the primary sources as you can. There are a few different types of source from the era which all help to build an understanding. First, there are the accounts of the conquistadors, Cortez himself as well as Bernal Diaz del Castillo. They drew maps, wrote descriptions and impressions, and gave in-depth timelines. They were also writing to justify their actions, though, and their accounts have an unlikely level of serendipity contained within them, like Cortez finding a secret door which led to all of Montezuma's gold in his own apartment. Of the two, Castillo's is more in-depth, showing greater curiosity and empathy towards the Aztec people. Students of this time will find both accounts in the public domain, and it is fascinating to compare Castillo and Cortez's impression of events. For example, Cortez speaks of taking Montezuma hostage as though he was almost grateful for the opportunity, whilst Castillo remembers the fear and great anxiety of the Aztec king. More reliable and less biased are the codices written by Spanish friars like Bernardino de Sahagún and Diego Duran, who spoke Nahuatl and compiled large encyclopedias and ethnographic studies in the years after the conquest. These volumes contain a great deal of indigenous input and art, and are the best surviving impressions of the Aztec Empire. Whilst they wrote from a European perspective, both friars believed it was only through documenting and understanding fully the indigenous people that they would be able to convert them. For his work, Sahagún has been credited with being the world's first anthropologist. There are a few indigenous sources, and what exists has generally been related secondhand to Spanish historians and anthropologists. Of note is the particularly savage recounting of the Spanish massacre of Aztec worshippers in Tenochtitlan. This paucity in documentary resource is reflected in a similar lack of broad archaeological evidence, as the Spanish destroyed much of significance to the Aztec. The materials out of which empire is built also affects the 21st century historian. The houses of the powerful were made of stone, those of the weak were made of mud. The words of the powerful were written down, those of the weak were merely spoken. In this way we arrive in the 21st century with very little archaeological evidence of the vast Aztec empire, as most of it has returned to the earth, apart from the foundations of Montezuma's palace and his throne, which is still intact, if empty. The descriptions in this video have been a conservative interpretation of Castillo's account, cross-referenced with academic understandings, the more controversial of which have been left out. But it's important to note that between these documents flow a vast many interpretations. Most recently, for example, is the mind-bending theory that Cortez was in fact just another animal in Montezuma's great zoo, or that the Tlaxcalcans were the real masterminds behind the entire invasion of the New World. The entire field of inquiry demonstrates the need for good historians in all times. If you were to expire tomorrow and we had to collect all the data you've left behind, what story would that tell? Or, if you were to expire tomorrow and only the person who killed you was allowed to write your story, what do you think they'd write?